Understanding the hidden costs of minimum wage laws. What if the policy designed to help workers is preventing them from getting jobs? For most people, the minimum wage represents a simple moral proposition. No one should work for too little. A government-mandated floor on wages appears to be an obvious way to protect workers, fight exploitation, and reduce poverty. After all, who could oppose higher pay for society's most vulnerable members? But economics isn't about intentions, it's about consequences, especially the ones we don't immediately see. This is the fundamental problem with minimum wage laws. What they appear to offer, higher incomes, comes with hidden costs that ripple through the economy. Some effects are immediate, lost jobs and reduced hours. Others are long-term, and invisible jobs that never get created, businesses that never open, and technologies that quietly replace workers priced out of the market. This isn't a speculative theory, it's the logic of economics and the testimony of history. Today, we'll examine the minimum wage not as a moral symbol, but as an economic policy. We'll explore how it works in practice, identify who gets helped and who gets hurt, and reveal what gets quietly erased from view. As French economist Frédéric Bastiat observed, there is only one difference between a bad economist and a good one. The bad economist confines himself to the visible effect. The good economist takes into account both the effect that can be seen and those effects that must be foreseen. When the government sets a minimum price for labor, it does something it would never dare attempt in any other market. It bans voluntary exchange. If you're willing to work for $9 an hour, and an employer is willing to pay you $9 an hour, you cannot legally make that deal if the minimum wage is $10. In theory, this seems to help workers. In practice, it simply outlaws employment for anyone whose skills or productivity doesn't justify the new wage floor. It transforms the weakest players in the labor market, young people, low-skill workers, and immigrants into unemployables, not by choice, but by law. Here's the paradox. If a minimum wage increase doesn't destroy jobs immediately, supporters declare victory. But if it prevents new jobs from being created, that loss never makes headlines. No one reports on a job that wasn't offered. No one documents the cafe that didn't hire a second barista or a small business that remained closed because it couldn't afford the labor costs. These losses are real, but invisible. This is why minimum wage laws are particularly dangerous, not because they're always catastrophic, but because the damage they inflict is subtle, dispersed, and difficult to measure. The harm is quiet but persistent, accumulating in missed opportunities, stalled careers, and dreams quietly buried under regulatory burden. Over the following sections, we'll examine how this policy affects employment, prices, automation, inequality, and taxation. We'll analyze real-world cases from the United States to Europe and explain why so many costs of the minimum wage fall precisely on the people it's supposed to help. The question isn't whether raising the minimum wage feels good, the question is whether it works. Once you understand what is not being seen, you may never view this policy the same way again. What is the minimum wage? At its core, the minimum wage is a price control, specifically a government-imposed floor on the price of labor. It represents the lowest hourly rate an employer is legally permitted to pay a worker. In theory, it guarantees every job pays at least a livable amount. In economic terms, it forbids people from working for less than a government-determined number, regardless of their circumstances, skills, or willingness to accept that wage. Most people conceptualize the minimum wage as a basic labor right, similar to workplace safety standards or anti-discrimination laws. However, unlike those protections, the minimum wage interferes directly with the price mechanism, the system through which supply and demand interact to determine market value. In this case, that something being priced is human time and effort. In a free market, wages emerge organically based on productivity. Employers compete for labor while workers compete for jobs. The resulting wage reflects the marginal productivity of labor. What the last worker hired contributes to the firm's output. If someone can produce $12 worth of value per hour, they can reasonably expect to earn close to $12 hourly. If their output is worth only $6, their wage will gravitate towards that level, assuming market forces operate freely. The minimum wage disrupts this dynamic. When the law mandates that no one can earn less than $10 per hour, anyone whose productivity falls below that threshold is effectively banned from employment. It's not merely that they'll struggle to find work, they're priced out of the labor market by legal decree. The wage they could have accepted, the one that might have provided entry, taught them skills, and led to better opportunities, no longer exists. It has been outlawed. Here lies the crucial understanding. Minimum wage laws don't create higher wages, they prohibit lower ones. They don't cause employers to suddenly value labor more, they simply make certain labor arrangements illegal. When you forbid contracts below a specified price, you don't improve those contracts, you make them vanish. Certainly, not everyone earns the minimum wage. In the United States, only about 1 to 2% of workers officially receive at or below the federal minimum. But this statistic misses the broader point. The minimum wage sets the floor for the entire lower end of the wage distribution. It affects millions of workers indirectly by elevating the bottom rungs of the wage ladder, compressing wage differentials, and altering incentives for hiring, training, and automation. The minimum wage also creates false security. Politicians point to the law and claim they've raised people's income with legislative action. In reality, they've introduced a blunt constraint on voluntary exchange, something that invariably carries trade-offs. Another critical issue: the minimum wage is uniform, but productivity isn't. A 16-year-old with no experience doesn't bring the same value as a 40-year-old with years of experience. Yet the law treats them identically. A worker in rural Mississippi doesn't face the same living costs as someone in downtown San Francisco. Again, the law doesn't differentiate. It imposes a single national rule on incredibly diverse economic realities. This one-size-fits-all approach creates systematic distortions. In high-productivity, high-cost areas, a higher minimum wage might not cause significant disruption because wages already exceed it. However, in low-productivity regions or sectors with narrow margins, even modest increases can trigger cascading effects: fewer jobs, shorter shifts, business closures, or forced automation. Here's the ultimate irony. While advocates claim minimum wage laws protect workers from exploitation, what they actually accomplish is excluding the weakest from participating in the labor market at all. A person willing to work for $8 per hour, perhaps because they're young, unskilled, or new to the country, is told by law that their labor has no place in the economy unless someone will pay them more than they're currently worth. This isn't just economically inefficient, it's fundamentally cruel. The minimum wage is often portrayed as social justice in action. In practice, it's a legal barrier between people and work. Now that we understand what it is and how it functions in theory, let's examine what happens when it's applied in the real world. How wages rise: capital, productivity, and time. If minimum wages don't create lasting prosperity, what does? The answer is straightforward, but often forgotten: capital accumulation. In a market economy, wages don't flow from employer generosity. They stem from productivity, and productivity depends entirely on capital. The more capital available to a worker, the more valuable their labor becomes. Give someone a shovel and they dig more effectively than with bare hands. Provide an excavator and they move 100 times more earth. The same person becomes dramatically more productive simply because better tools are available. Capital encompasses machines, tools, infrastructure, training, software, and logistics. Everything that allows humans to accomplish more with less effort. The more capital an economy accumulates, the more it can afford to pay its workers. This explains why a construction worker in Switzerland earns more than one in Bangladesh. The difference isn't effort or dedication, it's productivity driven by accumulated capital. This represents the fundamental distinction between natural wage growth and artificial wage mandates. In a healthy, capital-rich economy, wages rise because businesses invest, compete for workers, and need to attract and retain talent. These wage increases are sustainable because they're backed by genuine economic output. Contrast this with minimum wage laws, top-down mandates disconnected from capital, productivity, or economic conditions. They don't make workers more productive, they simply make low-productivity workers too expensive to hire. Instead of lifting the floor through progress, they raise it artificially and block access for everyone who can't reach the new height. Here we encounter an important paradox. Earlier, we noted that minimum wages can accelerate automation, and this is accurate. When low-skilled labor becomes artificially expensive, businesses often respond by replacing it with machines. This might appear efficient, but it differs fundamentally from genuine capital-driven progress. Why? Because the timing is wrong. Automation forced by law doesn't occur because it makes the business better. It happens because legislation makes employing humans unviable. This isn't innovation, it's economic triage. In contrast, when automation arises naturally because new technology is superior, faster, or cheaper than human labor, it reflects genuine productivity gains. It frees workers to pursue more valuable activities. This kind of transition creates new employment opportunities and raises wages over time. But when automation is forced by regulation, it can destroy opportunities before they materialize. Yes, automation represents a powerful tool for increasing wages, but it must follow economic logic, not political imperatives. True prosperity doesn't come from outlawing low wages, it emerges from allowing markets to function, capital to accumulate, and workers to become more productive over time. And policy that short-circuits this process, whether through wage controls, punitive taxation, or rigid labor laws, doesn't help the poor. It traps them by preventing them from accessing the first rung of the economic ladder. Wages rise when work becomes more valuable. This happens when capital and freedom combine, not when the government draws arbitrary lines and calls it justice. What is seen? Higher wages. When the government raises the minimum wage, the effect is immediate and highly visible. News outlets cover the new figures extensively. Headlines proclaim historic increases, politicians declare victory for working families. Workers earning the legal minimum see their paychecks grow. For many, it represents the first time in years that wages feel like they're catching up to the living costs. This is what everyone sees. For those earning just above the minimum, something additional occurs. Their wages often increase too. Employers raise pay floors to maintain internal wage hierarchies. The increase cascades upward, tightening gaps between the lowest paid and mid-level workers. Some economists call this a spillover effect. Others view it as wage compression. Regardless of terminology, the short-term result is clear. Millions of workers see larger paychecks. Consider the United States as an example. When proposals emerged to raise the federal minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 per hour, analysts estimate over 27 million workers will be affected. Approximately 17 million earn less than $15 and would receive direct raises. The remaining 10 million earn close enough to that threshold that employers would likely adjust their wages to maintain internal equity. In terms of immediate impact, this is substantial. Or examine Spain, where minimum wages were raised aggressively between 2019 and 2023. Overnight, hundreds of thousands of workers who previously earned 900 euros per month became legally entitled to 1,050 euros or more. The boost was concrete, visible, and politically powerful. This explains why minimum wage laws are so politically attractive. They create tangible benefits that are easy to document. Pay increased, that's good. End of story. At least on the surface. The policy feels morally correct. The idea that no one should earn below a certain threshold resonates emotionally, tapping into intuitions about human dignity and worth. In a world where prices rise faster than wages, where housing becomes unaffordable, and where inequality dominates headlines, the minimum wage becomes symbolic, a promise that society hasn't abandoned its lowest earners. To casual observers, it appears to be a win-win scenario. Workers receive more money, employers continue hiring, and the economy moves forward. Sometimes this is even true, superficially. In high productivity areas, where most jobs already pay above the new minimum, legal changes have minimal disruptive impact. Employers absorb adjustments easily. In booming urban centers, local economies might support $15 wage floors without mass layoffs. In these cases, the policy appears to work, fueling arguments for pushing wages even higher. But this is precisely where the danger lies. When we measure only what is seen, tracking wage increases without counting jobs that vanish or never appear, we blind ourselves to the policy's true effects. We observe paychecks that grow larger, but not shifts that were eliminated. We see workers who kept their jobs, not ones who weren't hired. We hear stories of people finally earning more, but not about small businesses closing, freezing hiring, or replacing roles with automation. The visible is comforting and easy to quantify and document. But in economics, what matters most is often what doesn't happen, and those absences rarely make the news. So yes, when minimum wages rise, many people receive raises. In the short term, for those individuals, the benefit is real. But the crucial question isn't, did some workers get more money? The real question is, what had to happen in the background to make that possible, and who paid the price? To answer this, we must look beyond headlines into the quiet distortions underneath. As Bastiat warned, good economics examines not just what is seen, but what remains unseen. What is Unseen, Part 1, The Jobs That Never Happen. The true cost of minimum wage laws isn't just in lost jobs, it's in employment opportunities that never exist in the first place. No one observes a job that isn't created. No one counts a shift that's never offered. but this is precisely where the most significant damage begins. Let's return to fundamentals. In a free labor market, wages reflect productivity. If you can generate $10 worth of value per hour, someone, somewhere, is willing to pay close to that amount. If law mandates a minimum wage of $12, then suddenly no one is legally permitted to hire you at your market value. Not because you're lazy or lack potential, simply because your current output doesn't meet the legal threshold. You are priced out by law. This doesn't appear as a layoff or show up in unemployment statistics. It's a non-event, a decision never made, a contract never signed, a skill never developed. It happens quietly and invisibly in thousands of businesses and industries daily. Economists call this a missing market. There exists a willing worker and a willing employer, but the state intervenes and declares, no, that wage is too low. Even if both parties would benefit from the agreement, it remains forbidden. The result is legally mandated unemployment. Someone who wants to work and someone who wants to hire them, but the transaction is outlawed. This is where Austrian economic critique becomes most pointed. Thinkers like Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard argued that minimum wage laws don't raise real wages, they outlaw employment for the least productive workers. The people most needing experience, stability, and income are pushed aside, not by market forces, but by legislation. This exclusion particularly affects teenagers with no work history seeking their first job experience, immigrants with language barriers trying to enter the workforce, and ex-convicts trying to re-enter the labor force and rebuild their lives. It also impacts disabled workers with reduced physical capacity who could contribute meaningfully at market wages, as well as entrepreneurs who could hire one additional person but can't afford the mandated minimum. These individuals vanish from the labor market, not because they're worthless, but because the state has declared their labor unworthy of exchange at any price below the legal minimum. The higher you raise the minimum wage, the more people get excluded. At $8 per hour, perhaps only the bottom 2% are priced out. At $15, it might be 10% or more. At $20, even higher. The higher the floor, the more people you trap in the basement. None of this appears in headline statistics. Most employment reports track net jobs, not potential jobs that might have been created if labor were more affordable. They don't count informal arrangements that never become formal employment. They don't track part-time roles that weren't expanded, or small shops that didn't open a second location. All of this falls into what Bastiat called the realm of the unseen, the world that would have existed had intervention not interfered. This represents the cruelest irony of minimum wage laws. The very people they claim to protect, the marginal, inexperienced, and vulnerable, are precisely the ones who quietly disappear from the economy when wages are set by force instead of market value. No termination notice, no protest, just silence. When minimum wages increase, some workers receive raises. Others simply never get the opportunity to work at all. What is unseen, Part 2. Automation that doesn't wait. When labor becomes more expensive, businesses seek alternatives. Increasingly, that alternative is automation. Automation isn't new, it's been occurring for centuries, from the spinning jenny to the assembly line to today's artificial intelligence. But what many people don't realize is that the pace of automation is shaped by regulation, not just technology. Well-timed innovation that genuinely increases productivity can free workers to move into new roles, expand industries, and raise living standards. But when automation becomes a survival strategy rather than a competitive advantage, it can destroy more than it creates. Minimum wage laws accelerate this forced type of automation. Consider a small restaurant opening on thin margins. It employs cashiers, dishwashers, and prep cooks, all performing essential but relatively low-skilled jobs. The government raises the minimum wage from $12 to $16. The owner calculates that labor costs will jump by 20% or more. Profits evaporate. The business isn't large enough to raise prices without losing customers. What's the alternative? Replace people with machines. The technological substitution follows a predictable pattern. Touchscreen kiosks replace cashiers at the counter, automated conveyor belt dishwashers handle kitchen cleanup, prepackaged ingredients from centralized suppliers reduce prep work, and potentially robotic cooking equipment takes over food preparation where technology permits. Each decision reduces headcount, not necessarily because machines are superior, but because humans have been made artificially expensive. The business doesn't automate for efficiency, it automated because the law made human labor unaffordable. This isn't science fiction. In cities like San Francisco, New York, and Seattle, Where local minimum wages have surged past $15, many restaurants now rely almost entirely on kiosks, QR code ordering, and delivery apps. Grocery stores offer extensive self-checkout options, fast food chains experiment with robotic kitchens, even retail stores explore AI-driven inventory systems that reduce need for floor staff. To consumers, these changes feel modern, but to workers who might have filled those positions, they represent lost opportunities. This isn't to suggest automation is inherently bad. On the contrary, when driven by genuine productivity gains, automation is a powerful force for good. It allows us to accomplish more with less, reallocate labor to higher value tasks, and lift living standards over time. But forced automation, triggered by regulatory pressure rather than technological merit, is fundamentally different. It replaces workers not because machines are ready, but because policy leaves no choice. It creates transition without buffer time. The people who lose out are often those already struggling to enter the labor force. Consider the teenager who might have worked a register for summer employment, now there's a kiosk. Think of the immigrant who might have washed dishes as a first step into the economy, now there's a machine. These weren't glamorous positions, but they were stepping stones. They provided access points to something better. Now they're gone. Minimum wage advocates often dismiss this as inevitable. But that's misleading. What's inevitable is progress. What's not inevitable is the pace of change or who gets left behind. In a market economy, transitions are gradual. Businesses adapt, workers retain, and labor shifts from lower value to higher value uses. But when the policy forces change faster than the economy can absorb it, the result is disruption, dislocation, and exclusion. Minimum wage laws don't prevent exploitation, they accelerate substitution. The machine doesn't complain, take sick days, or require training. Once it's cheaper than human alternatives, it's permanent. And the worker who needed that job to start their career, they're left looking in from the outside. What is Unseen Part 3? The Businesses That Don't Survive. There's another casualty of minimum wage laws that rarely receives attention: the small businesses that don't survive. When wages increase by legal mandate, not market conditions, someone must absorb the cost. Sometimes it's consumers through higher prices, sometimes it's workers through reduced hours or less flexibility. But often, the one who bears this burden is the business owner, especially small and medium-sized enterprises operating on razor-thin margins. Unlike large corporations, small businesses lack deep pockets. They can't easily afford automation, they can't relocate to cheaper areas, and they certainly can't absorb a 20% jump in labor costs without significant impact. Their options are severely limited: raise prices and risk losing customers, cut staff and reduce service quality, or close permanently. This vulnerability is especially acute in hospitality and food service, where labor represents a major cost component. Retail establishments, where low-skill, high-turnover jobs dominate, face similar challenges. Personal services, including salons, car washes, and small repair shops, are equally at risk. These businesses are deeply rooted in local communities. They employ neighbors, offer first jobs to young people, and fill niches that large chains don't address. They're also the most vulnerable to wage mandates. Seattle provides a real-world example. After the city implemented a phased increase to a $15 minimum wage, several academic studies examined the effects on small businesses. Research from the University of Washington found that while hourly wages rose, total hours worked fell, particularly in small establishments. Overall, low-wage workers earned slightly less per month than before the increase, because fewer hours were available. Some businesses cut staff, others closed locations, some stopped hiring altogether. While larger chains survived, sometimes even thrived, the smallest, most labor-intensive firms paid the highest price. This matters because small businesses aren't just economic engines. They're pathways to upward mobility. A family-owned shop can serve as a training ground. A side hustle can become full-time employment. A local cafe can provide a first taste of entrepreneurship. When costs are artificially inflated, these entry points disappear. Again, none of this appears in national employment data. You don't see the cafe that never opened, the second location that was never launched, the job posting that was never written, or the entrepreneurial dream abandoned because the numbers didn't work. The losses are real, they simply don't show up in statistics. Supporters of minimum wage laws sometimes argue that businesses unable to pay a living wage don't deserve to survive. This may sound principled, but it's economically shallow. A business that can't afford to pay $15 might still afford $12, and in doing so, provide jobs, training, and value that would otherwise vanish. Destroying these opportunities doesn't help the poor, it limits their options. In reality, most small businesses aren't exploiting workers. They're struggling entrepreneurs trying to survive. They'd love to pay more if the market allowed it, but when the government dictates wages without regard to productivity or context, the result is predictable: closures, consolidation, and market concentration. Who benefits from this consolidation? Often, the largest firms, big chains with automation budgets, scalable systems, and enough political influence to weather regulatory changes. The result is less diversity, less competition, and fewer choices for everyone. Once again, it's the people at the bottom, workers, customers, and aspiring business owners, who pay the price. What is unseen? Part 4. Inflation and the cost of living. One of the most common justifications for raising minimum wages is that living costs keep increasing. Housing becomes more expensive, groceries cost more, and gas, electricity, and transportation all seem to rise, while paychecks remain stagnant. In this context, raising the minimum wage sounds not just reasonable, but necessary. After all, if living costs increase, shouldn't wages follow? But here's the critical flaw. Raising the minimum wage doesn't reduce the cost of living. In many cases, it makes it worse, especially for the very people it's supposed to help. When you increase the cost of labor across the economy, you don't just raise wages, you also raise the cost of producing goods and services. These costs ripple outward throughout the economic system. Consider a small restaurant where labor represents 35 to 40% of total expenses. If the minimum wage increases by 20% and the business wants to survive, it must choose from several challenging options. It can raise prices to customers, though this risks losing price-sensitive clientele. It can reduce staff size, which compromises service quality. It can cut corners on service levels or product quality. It can invest in automation if capital is available. Most commonly, however, businesses choose to raise prices. Now multiply this scenario across every restaurant, grocery store, delivery service, cleaning company, and daycare center. All face higher labor costs. All respond by charging more for their services. What's the result? The cost of living rises. This proves particularly damaging in sectors where minimum wage labor is most concentrated: food service, retail, hospitality, and transportation. These aren't luxury items. They're essential goods and services that low-income people consume daily. Ironically, the same people who receive minimum wage increases also bear the brunt of the resulting inflation. Suppose you're a worker whose wage increased from $12 to $15 per hour, a 25% raise. But if you rent, groceries and utility bills increase by 10 to 15% over the same period because businesses are passing on higher costs. You're not as far ahead as you might think. Your real wage, what you can purchase with your paycheck, may have increased only slightly or even remained flat. In some cases, prices can rise faster than wages, especially if minimum wage increases cause disruption to supply chains or trigger cost shocks in key industries. This leads to stagflation, higher prices, slower growth, and fewer opportunities for marginal workers. There's also a secondary effect. When wages rise artificially, it creates pressure on other wage tiers. Mid-level workers, those earning just above the new minimum, begin demanding raises too. If someone who used to earn $15 now makes the same as a new hire with no experience, they feel undervalued. Employers either increase their pay or risk losing them. This adds another layer of cost, which gets passed on again. The inflationary cycle continues. Not every minimum wage increase leads to runaway inflation. In high productivity areas where wages are already above the legal floor, the impact might be muted. But in low-income regions or industries with tight margins, the inflationary impact can be substantial and regressive. This means the poorest suffer the most. Not only do they face employment risk, but their basic expenses rise, eating away at gains from higher wages. This isn't just theoretical. After significant minimum wage increases in cities like Los Angeles and New York, prices in low-end service industries rose noticeably. In some cases, menu prices at fast food chains increased by 10 to 15% within a single year. That's not just a bump, that's a tax on consumers, paid at the cash register. It's a hidden tax. No one sees a line item stating inflation due to wage laws, but it's embedded in every burger, bus ticket, and babysitting service purchased. Minimum wage laws aim to increase purchasing power, but when they raise prices simultaneously, they often chase their own tail. The wage increases, but so does the cost of everything that wage is supposed to buy. It's a cycle that sounds generous, but ends in frustration. What is Unseen? Part 5. The Tax Trap. We've discussed how minimum wage laws can lead to job losses, automation, higher prices, and business closures. But there's one more consequence, quieter and more technical, but equally insidious: taxation. When wages increase, taxes increase too, and not just for businesses. Let's start with income taxes. In many countries, especially those with progressive tax systems, higher earnings mean higher tax rates. When the government mandates wage increases, it may push workers into higher tax brackets. This means part of their raise goes directly to the treasury, not into their pockets. Spain provides a stark example. In 2025, the government raised the minimum wage to €1,184 per month, one of the most aggressive increases in recent years. Politicians declared it a victory for the working class. But there was a significant catch. For the first time, full-time minimum wage earners became subject to personal income tax. According to official reports, a single person earning minimum wage who previously paid nothing now faces an annual tax bill of nearly €300. That might not sound substantial, but it represents over 40% of the total annual wage increase. In other words, nearly half of the raise was reclaimed by the state. This created public outrage. Workers who expected financial gains found themselves writing checks to the tax agency. The very policy meant to help them had opened a new channel for the government to collect from them. Consider the employer perspective. When minimum wages increase, payroll taxes, Social Security contributions, and unemployment insurance premiums all rise proportionally, because they're typically calculated as a percentage of gross wages. Every additional euro or dollar the employer pays in higher wages generates more revenue for the state. Governments rarely highlight this aspect. But from a fiscal standpoint, minimum wage increases are revenue generators. They don't just transfer income from employer to employee. They carve out a slice for the public sector too. This also distorts worker incentives. Suppose a worker moves from €1,000 to €1,200 monthly due to a mandated wage increase. If €100 of that raise gets taxed away, and another €50 goes to higher social contributions, the real net gain might be closer to €50. That's less than a 5% improvement in actual take-home pay, despite appearing as a 20% raise in the headlines. Now imagine this happening to millions of workers simultaneously. Governments get to boast about helping the poor while quietly increasing their revenue streams. Even more damaging is the effect on benefits and subsidies. In many welfare systems, higher wages reduce eligibility for social programs, housing support, child care vouchers, and tax credits. As gross wages rise, net disposable income may stagnate or even fall once taxes and lost benefits are accounted for. This creates what economists call a welfare cliff. Earn slightly more, lose significantly. Some workers discover that after a wage increase, they're worse off. They earn too much to qualify for support programs, but not enough to compensate for their loss. Once again, the effect is hidden. Workers see higher paychecks, but then face higher rent, higher taxes, and fewer subsidies. The government sees higher revenue, and the narrative continues: we raised wages, be grateful. In truth, the minimum wage often functions as a closed loop, from worker to employer to government and back again, with losses at every turn. What was intended as a transfer of value becomes a transfer of burden. And the poorest? They carry the weight through complexity, disincentives, and diminished net income. Does the minimum wage reduce poverty? This is the central promise of minimum wage laws. They will reduce poverty. The logic seems straightforward: raise the wage floor and low-income workers will earn more. With higher incomes, they'll afford better housing, healthier food, education, and maybe even save money. The policy is marketed as a simple tool for lifting people out of poverty. No bureaucracy, no applications, just more money for those who need it the most. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The minimum wage is a remarkably blunt and ineffective weapon against poverty. In the United States, studies from the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, and the National Bureau of Economics Research, NBER, reveal that most minimum wage earners are not poor adults supporting families. Instead, they tend to be teenagers living at home with their parents, college students working part-time, or secondary earners in middle-income households. One CBO report found that only about 19% of benefits from a federal minimum wage increase would reach families below the poverty line. The remaining 81% would go to households already above it. Why does this occur? Because poverty isn't about low wages, it's about not working at all. The minimum wage doesn't help unemployed people. If anything, it can create more unemployment by pricing out the least skilled workers. Meanwhile, the poorest of the poor, those with no skills, no experience, or major barriers to employment, are often the ones most likely to be priced out of the labor market entirely when minimum wages rise. They don't benefit from the policy, they get excluded by it. Here's a key point often overlooked. A higher wage only helps if you can keep your job. For those who lose employment or can't get hired in the first place, the minimum wage doesn't reduce poverty, it reinforces it. International evidence supports this pattern. In Germany, the introduction of a national minimum wage in 2015 was followed by stable aggregate employment levels, but also by an increase in many jobs, low-hour, precarious work arrangements that skirt the edge of full-time employment. In South Africa, a 2019 minimum wage law led to an 8% drop in the employment among domestic workers. In Latin America, aggressive minimum wage increases have often resulted in greater informality as businesses evade the law entirely by moving operations underground. These examples demonstrate that context matters enormously. A minimum wage might appear to work in a wealthy, high-productivity economy, but in fragile or low-productivity environments, it deepens unemployment and drives work into the shadows. Consider this question. If your goal is to raise incomes for the poor, why not target the poor directly? That's exactly what policies like the Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC, accomplish. In the United States, the EITC supplements wages for low-income earners without interfering with labor contracts. It encourages work, supports families, and doesn't price anyone out of the job market. It's also more efficient. Unlike the minimum wage, which delivers gains unevenly and often to the wrong people, targeted transfers focus benefits where they're actually needed. They also don't raise prices, don't harm small businesses, and don't create black markets for labor. But EITCs require budgets, bureaucracy, and political will. Minimum wage laws, by contrast, cost the government nothing on paper and generate excellent headlines. That's why they're popular, even when they fail to achieve their stated objectives. So, does the minimum wage reduce poverty? Sometimes, a little, for some people. But at what cost? And how many unintended victims? The minimum wage functions as a symbol of concern for the poor, but it's a fundamentally weak policy tool for actually helping them. Conclusion. The minimum wage represents one of those policies that sounds good, looks good, and feels good until you examine what lies beneath the surface. On paper, it promises higher wages for low-income workers. In practice, it delivers a complex mixture of visible gains and invisible costs. We've seen the full range of effects that flow from minimum wage policies. On the visible side, some workers receive immediate raises, political victories are declared, and headlines celebrate apparent progress. But the hidden costs tell a different story. Some workers lose hours or unemployment entirely. Others are never hired at all. Businesses adapt through automation or close permanently. Prices rise across the economy, tax burdens shift and increase, social benefits disappear, and paradoxically, the poorest may end up worse off than before. Yet, most of these consequences go unreported. Why? Because what is seen, the larger paycheck, the celebratory headlines, is easy to observe and document. But what is not seen, the lost job, the closed store, the unhired teenager, the slow erosion of opportunity remains invisible. It leaves no statistical footprint. This perfectly exemplifies what Frederick Bastiat warned about in the 19th century in his essay, What is Seen and What is Not Seen. He wrote, "Between good and bad economists, this constitutes the whole difference. The one takes account of the visible effect. The other takes account both of the effect that can be seen and of those which is necessary to foresee." The minimum wage serves as a textbook case for this principle. It focuses on intentions over consequences, optics over economics, and visibility over truth. If we genuinely care about raising wages sustainably, we should focus on what works. Capital accumulation that makes workers more productive, genuine productivity growth that creates real economic value, lower barriers to business formation that increase competition for workers, flexible labor markets that allow voluntary exchanges, and targeted support for those who need it most without distorting market mechanisms. These represent the true engines of sustainable prosperity, not wage controls imposed by government decree. The greatest injustice isn't earning a low wage. it's being legally prevented from entering the market at all. So the next time someone asks, why not raise the minimum wage? Consider asking them, what are you not seeing? Behind every visible benefit of wage mandates, there may be dozens of quiet losses, opportunities that never materialized, businesses that never opened, workers who never got their first chance, and dreams that were quietly buried under the weight of well-intentioned regulations. Now that you have seen what is not seen, you understand both the visible effects and the hidden consequences. You recognize that in economics, as in life, the essential truths are often invisible to the eye. The minimum wage promises to help society's most vulnerable workers. In reality, it often becomes the barrier that keeps them from getting started in the first place. True compassion lies not in setting wage floors, but in removing the obstacles that prevent people from climbing toward better opportunities through their own effort and voluntary exchange. The choice is ours: policies that sound good or policies that work.